Now, though, let's go to Gareth Hughes, Director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa, former Green MP, no longer a member of any political party, and also with us Ben Thomas, former National Government Press Secretary, columnist and also a Director of Public Affairs firm Capital. Kia ora, korua, tēnā korua.
Kia ora morena.
Lovely to have you both here this morning. Let's start with a new initiative unveiled by the Prime Minister, $70 million in total of a funding boost for events and tourism, much of it going to Auckland. Ben, how does this land for you, in current cost of living crisis?
Well, look, it'll be a huge relief to various people, crushed under the cost of living crisis, like one young lady who was interviewed by One News about the cost of living earlier this year, talking about how she couldn't afford to live away from home because she had spent all of her money going to Australia to watch Taylor Swift. So this could be relief for a lot of hardworking Kiwis. But I mean, it's interesting to see where it sits in with the government's sort of larger strategy. Obviously, increasing tourism, both within New Zealand and from without New Zealand, has been a priority identified by the government in terms of its economic growth agenda. Obviously getting people out and spending, in order to, bring ahead this long-awaited economic recovery. Right now, a lot happening in the savings space, the paying down space, but not really feeling it in terms of, people out there spending. So look, it makes sense in those terms. Is it really consistent with the sort of broader narrative of we need to get the settings right and we need to get the regulation in place and we need to, for instance, free up Eden Park to have more nights, whatever Helen Clark might say. But, then you realise that there are limits to that, and in the large event space, it's things like the weak New Zealand dollar, the high cost of getting here, even tacking it on to Australia, and the way that these sort of mega events, I think Pink, for instance, basically had a residency in Melbourne. They do basically a week of performances, and that's hard to scale in New Zealand. And so we are in this sort of situation where, it kind of might require saying, Travis Kelce, have your honeymoon here and we'll give you $1 million.
Gareth, how does this land for you? I mean, I heard some texters into Morning Report saying, this is all nice to have stuff. What about the teachers? What about the nurses? What about, pay rises that many in the public sector are going for at the moment? Do we really need to be throwing money at this direction?
Well, I mean, that's it exactly. My kids are home away from school this week because the teachers are striking, and I'm not sure how many teachers and doctors are particularly happy to, be spending all this money trying to attract Sabrina Carpenter down to New Zealand or ACDC. We're kind of stuck in the situation where we spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build these stadiums, then they're not used, so then we have to spend tens of millions of dollars more to try and attract them down here. But I guess for the government, right, it's really reflective of the deep pressure they're under, particularly in Auckland and Wellington, with the economy underperforming. You've got a former national leader, Simon Bridges, calling for sort of more economic intervention in those cities. People are speculating who's going to last longest, Scott, the coach of the All Blacks or the current Prime Minister. So this is the pressure they're under, and it's not really going to make a huge difference, particularly for the tourism industry. If, Sabrina Carpenter's coming to Australia, Aussies aren't going to come to New Zealand. Where else are these tourists going to come to spend money in Auckland for these major events?
This is the thing, I suppose, Ben, isn't it? Because is this at the right point of the recovery to be putting this forward? Because there are a lot of people around the country who don't really feel like they've got the money to buy the ticket for Sabrina Carpenter or ACDC. Never mind the flights, the accommodation and all the rest of it if we're all going to have to go to Auckland for these things.
Well, look, people have been travelling for All Blacks games. People have been travelling for, all sorts of things. And like I said, people have been travelling over the ditch to see concerts. I mean, look, you would have to put it in the kind of a bit of a variant of the bread and circuses kind of policy area. But
we were just talking about classics before.
but in a way, I think this is somewhat relevant. David Seymour said something, I think it was a year or two ago, which I think has been very resonant, which is, are we at the bottom of the standard economic cycle and we're soon to come back up? Or are we at the end of basically a structural shift where New Zealand realises, after a long period of delusion, that we are no longer a high-income country that is a peer with countries like Australia. And one area that the middle class and middle class voters see that is when their favourite act announces that they're coming down to the southern hemisphere and they're giving New Zealand a miss. And so I think in a way this is kind of propping up, an effort to sort of prop up the national spirits and sort of say, no, look, we can still have nice things. But there is value in that, and it should help these sort of regional economies. But essentially, it is, I think, a bit of a sort of management of expectations of what New Zealanders actually can expect from where our country is situated.
And this is part of the problem, right? If you look at the last 30 years, each decade, our economic growth per capita has actually declined. We're slowing down our economic performance. It's because we've gone for these low-value industries like tourism. I remember Sir Paul Callaghan, who used to talk about every extra tourism job actually, on average, made us worse off in terms of incomes. Same thing with international students. They're trying to hit the same old classic hits, which hadn't worked in the past particularly well, in the hope that it'll somehow work in the future. So at a time when we're reducing science and R&D expenditure, it's not really a recipe for a healthy economy.
Let's talk a little bit more about some of the other big issues of the week. Te Pāti Māori winning the by-election in Tamaki Makaurau. We talked a little bit about that last week on the programme. But testing times for Labour coming here, not guaranteeing whether they'll work with Te Pāti Māori. This is off the back of the Takuta Ferris, well, not just one post. I think he doubled or possibly even tripled down on it eventually. Gareth, what is the situation for Labour as we begin to cast our eyes, of course, next year to election year?
Well, I mean, the by-election has opened the door on what Labour's Māori electorate and Māori outreach strategy is, and the government formation. What we know is both blocs, both left and right, are going to need two coalition or confidence and supply partners to form a government. The day of the big party with a couple of hang-on micro parties is well and truly over, it seems. For Labour, the by-election sent home a really strong message. They only got 1 in 3 votes. The historically famous Labour turnout machine, particularly in South Auckland, didn't seem to fire. We see turnout under 30%. These are, I think, warning lights for the Labour Party.
They must be worried about that, surely.
I've talked to people in the union and church sectors in South Auckland. They're not seeing a great deal of enthusiasm under the current leadership, under the current approach. So, if you can't turn out your absolute rock-solid red base, that is a warning sign for the future. But I'm not surprised. No parties really are ruling parties in or out at the moment. We'll probably see those negotiations or communication strategies roll out next week. But we do know National's going to try as hard as they can to try and drive a wedge, to paint Te Pāti Māori as extremist, as extremely radical, as Hipkins sort of beholden to them. At the same time, of course, Labour's going to be doing the same thing to National, with Seymour and Peters, portraying as extremists. But it is interesting, right? It was a stonking win for Te Pāti Māori at the by-election. Yet in the wake of that, we're not really talking about the rise of Te Pāti Māori, how they've got the energy and momentum. We're talking about wayward MPs. We're talking about this mystery about why their whip was removed from the role and seemingly unhappy about it. Potentially a party that's got some internal challenges. Yeah,
absolutely. Bringing an awful lot to the fore with what happened last week in Te Pāti Māori. And Ben, your reading of this, saying that no one's ruling anyone in or out. I think Winston Peters is ruling Labour out, or are they?
Well, he's ruling Hipkins out.
He's ruling Hipkins out. So on this, Ben, what will Labour be doing here? A bit of soul searching for them in the wake of this by-election loss. And what does it say about their plans for the Māori seats next time round?
Look, I don't think you can actually take too much out of the by-election result. It was a very low turnout. At the same time, Peeni Henare was already in Parliament. That's a tough sell to make to voters. It's extremely hard to campaign in those seats, particularly in a by-election, because you just don't have that kind of wall-to-wall coverage that you do during a general election. Tamaki Makaurau had the lowest turnout, I think, of any seat in the last election, 69%. And we saw, I think, not quite as low, but pretty low turnout also when Parakura Horomia died in office, and a roughly the same sort of proportion to Labour, who were the incumbent party at that point for Meka Whaitiri, versus the challenger from Te Party, or the Māori Party as it was then. So I don't think you would sort of see this as catastrophic for Labour, but what it does mean is that they can unfortunately have to bid farewell to any notion that the losses of those Māori electorates in 2023 was simply a sort of byproduct of their general loss of votes around the country. Obviously something different happening in the electorates. Te Pāti Māori, I think, have gone from strength to strength among their base since the election. Incredibly strong social media game, obviously inextricably linked to the Treaty Principles marches. It means that Te Pāti Māori is a factor that Labour and Chris Hipkins are going to have to contend with at the election. That means, and potentially afterwards, in terms of forming a government, but also in terms of explaining away every utterance of Te Pāti Māori's leaders, or Takuta Ferris's sort of nocturnal Instagram posts running up to the election. That's going to be tough for Labour.
How do you think are those posts playing, particularly with the electorate, when it comes to Takuta Ferris, as you say, those midnight posts that have been put up? Is this actually a situation where they're having to be in damage control or actually not?
Broadly speaking, I think posts like that can, or appear to confirm the fears of a lot of voters about Te Pāti Māori. This idea that they are a separatist party, that they are radicals, that that they hate Pākehā, which is certainly not true of their MPs, but that's what sort of that's what comes through in the headlines,
it's
right?
The vibe,
and Te Pāti Māori, I think, already has or had in previous polling by far the biggest negatives of any party. There are more voters who strongly dislike Te Pāti Māori than any other party. That includes ACT and New Zealand First, right? And that acts as a drag on Labour if they're seen as relying on Te Pāti Māori. Te Pāti Māori are, notwithstanding their internal ructions, fine. They will they will almost certainly keep those seats. That gives them 5% of Parliament at least. That means that they're in a good position. Who it leaves in a poor position is Labour, and it is kind of astounding that in what should be their sort of time of triumph, it seems that sort of cracks are appearing to emerge. And it's not clear what the kind of fissures there are. It's been suggested that it's a kind of gap between the kohanga kids, so described, the younger again, sort of it's all relative. I think Takuta Ferris is about the same age as Rawiri Waititi, but in terms of the younger, newer MPs versus the sort of leadership, unclear. No one's confirmed that.
Well, in my 2 decades of closely watching politics, I don't ever think I've seen a midnight post ever turn out well for the poster. It's my advice to politicians: just don't do it. It clearly wasn't a strategy from Te Pāti Māori, and there is a rational strategy where you do appeal to the genuine anger that's amongst Māori and particularly young people with this government. You're really attacking Te Tiriti, Te Reo, etc. But the fact is that he was doing it in defiance of his co-leaders. They had apologised, and that's not exactly clear, that relationship. So it does raise that question, is he going out on his own? Having been in a really small caucus myself with 8 MPs, they're currently 6 at the moment, it is tough. You actually need all your MPs to step up, take a leadership role. His comments around the fact they're kind of non-hierarchical, everyone has the same mana in the party caucus room, I can understand that, but that makes real pressures for a party. People are raising questions. Is it the influence of John Tamahiri in particular? If you look at their website, he's listed number 3 under the co-leaders. Is there some divisions there? But I don't think we really do have a clear understanding about what's happened with Miria Meno Kapa Kingi with the whip role. She seemed pretty unhappy about it, didn't want to talk about it. It was described as by Debbie Nariwa Paka to go out and campaign Yeah, who knows? But could be, respective of some of those splits. Interestingly, on Te Pāti Māori's relationship with Labour, I saw former Māori Party staffer Jack McDonald mention that it might not actually be in their interest to dive into a coalition agreement like ACT and New Zealand First have. Maybe do something like the Greens did last time in government, sort of one foot in government, one foot out. Where
so
you
confidence and supply situation.
Yeah, where perhaps you could have ministers, perhaps you could just have a veto over every government legislation Shaman put into the budget, but then you're not wearing all the costs that come by being a formal coalition partner.
Would something like that benefit Labour as well if they were putting together a government, Ben?
Oh, look, I think keeping as much distance between themselves and Te Pāti Māori as possible would benefit them. It would also allow them, I think more importantly for their electoral chances, to say we will not, have Te Pāti Māori around the cabinet table. Now, look, we know from the last government, at the very least, that these are malleable promises during a campaign. But it really will be incumbent on Labour to sort of either put some distance between themselves and Te Pāti Māori, or to reach an accommodation in which Te Pāti Māori is sort of almost as if the Greens and Labour have done in the past, where they sort of almost campaign. They consult very closely on campaigning. I don't see that happening for obvious reasons. But yeah, in terms of carving out those areas where, they could make accommodations. Because, of course, the bar for what smaller parties can get in coalition has been vastly raised by this government. I can't imagine that the Greens will settle for another sort of confidence and supply agreement where they get 400 refurbished homes and some energy-saving light bulbs and a memorandum of understanding to talk about some other issues, as they have in the past.
It's going to be an interesting time, certainly next year. This year, if we stay in what is currently happening, though, the Education Minister revealing more about the replacement for NCEA, some of the curriculum changes in the education reforms here. Questions, though, beginning to be raised. Gareth, I might come to you first on this, because what is your sense of the replacement for NCEA proposed at this stage, and how that's being handled and being received by the teaching workforce?
Well, Stanford is seen as quite a capable, high-performing minister, but I do wonder if perhaps she's bitten off a bit more than she could chew. For a Conservative party, they're doing an awful lot of reform in a pretty major area on top of all the other reform and resource management and all the other areas. So, on the outset, there was quite a lot of welcoming of the fundamental re-questioning of NCEA as the major qualification. But now what you've revealed is quite a big split in the education sector, which was always there, right? But there's no consensus how to go forward, and that's the challenge she is going to have now. How do we square that circle when you've got 64 principals last week urging the minister to press ahead with haste, but you've got 90 principals calling for an immediate halt? It's really, this rich school, poor school divide. I don't think there's a clear pathway forward how you make all sides happy. Ministers often say that if you're not making everyone happy, you're doing a good job through the middle. But to my mind, there isn't a super clear solution. If we go back to the old system where 50% of kids aren't even getting school cert, clearly we don't want to go back to a world like that where people are entering the workforce without those qualifications.
Yeah.
And she set a really short timeline for consultation. Her argument is it's only at the high level. We're not going into the detail yet. But I think that actually closes today. So for such a fundamental issue, the clock's ticking, and she hasn't given people much time to engage.
And certainly, Ben, teachers that I've spoken to making the point that, yes, this is some years away in terms of the exams or the assessments that may be sat. I think it's the current year 8s at school will be the first year to go through this qualification. So it feels like a long time. But certainly some teachers I've spoken to saying, well, it does, except we have to start teaching this next year. And while we're in the midst of course, getting the current cohort through NCEA. So actually, it's a pretty compressed time frame here.
Yeah, it's certainly a very short period to retool all of these curricula. Now, I mean, I think partially that's overstated in the sense that I don't think that they'll be introducing new knowledge that did not exist before into teaching. It'll just be, in terms of the groupings and sort of making sense of, how things are being done, so sort of more industry-led modules or, preparing, grouping, I guess, information and learning so that it's more, what they said, set for the future, although I'm not sure where journalism fits into that, no offence.
But journalism's already being taught in schools.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, for instance, communications, journalism, media, I mean, that's very similar to media studies, right? And maybe it's just a change in the emphasis. I don't think that detail exists yet. But on the other hand, civics, civics, politics and philosophy, that's something that people have been sort of asking for a long time. Yep. Something that could be useful if you can, with kids having, put away their phones for the day, maybe tell them a bit about why why political institutions exist as they do.
But do you think Erica Stanford may have bitten off more she can chew on this one?
Look, I think this is ambitious. I think that's probably the polite way of saying it. Yeah, look, it's certainly a challenge. On the other hand, I guess this government has taken on board some of the learnings of the previous government, which was, you can spend a lot of time talking and not get to and you can still have everybody in their corner, 60 on one side, 94 on the other side, and people aren't happy. I mean, these are pretty entrenched positions. The reason I think that this consultation period is short is because they know what they want to do. This is not a new debate or a new argument.
Having very defined pathways, though, in terms of sort of going down the academic side of things or going down the trades line of things and the more practical side of things, is that potentially an area that there may be some movement on with this consultation? Do either of you think? Because, of course, there are, people develop at different stages. It could well be you start off down one stream and need to change course at some point in high school.
Well, I just don't think there's enough information to be able to gauge that. At the same time, you see the removal of academic subjects such as art history facing the chopping block, the academic component of outdoor education being removed. Often you can do both, when you're doing a subject. Interesting new topics like mechatronics and space technology, as a bit of a space nerd, into that one. But, at the moment we're 800 teachers short, so this is already a difficult time for the sector, a time when the sector is already on strike literally this week. But again, if we take it back to first principles, once again we see a major reform that we don't have the cross-party, major party consensus. I think Willow Jean Prime, Labour's education spokesperson, was pretty unwise not to respond to the invitations for consultation. But equally so, it's such a short amount of time with such limited information, it's pretty hard to engage in an area like that. If Stanford does have a very clear sense of direction where she wants to go, I think the best thing she should be doing is trying to get the parties together, see where there is agreement, if that can be locked in. Kiwis are sick and tired of seeing the major parties flip-flop or bring in policies and the other party change it immediately.
A quick word on a couple of things. Shane Jones, keen to talk about radical changes to the energy market. It's something that's being floated at this stage, not really anything more than that, but I'd be interested to hear both of you and your reaction on that.
Yeah, I think this is something that Jones has been flagging for a while, ever since I think the energy, the shortages last winter, when energy prices spiked, a number of mills closed, shuttered. This is becoming an ever more pressing issue because of the gas running down much, much faster than we had thought. I think Jones sees a real chance to differentiate the party with big promises. Now, New Zealand First, I think, in the past has run on nationalising the gentailers. I think unless you're going to cause a sort of sovereign crisis here in terms of investment, that would be an extremely expensive job. And also, on the flip side, Jones in the past has talked about breaking up the gentailers, in terms of generation and retail functions. Now, that's less fraught with risk, if you keep them in the same ownership. So I think, really, I don't know that we learned too much more. I think perhaps Jones's position became less clarified over the weekend, but it became bigger. And I think that's what New Zealand First are interested in right now.
we did learn that they asked for the energy portfolio in the negotiations and were unsuccessful. So, politically, I think it's interesting. He's making the running on a deeply unpopular sector where we literally are seeing deindustrialisation around the country. Kiwis are sick of their rising power bills. He's making the running on it, not the opposition. The headlines didn't quite match the detail in the report. They were all about nationalisation. Actually, that wasn't his preferred option. I mean, already with their superannuation changes, that's 15 billion. What's nationalisation? Maybe 7 billion on top. Coal and oil, though, that's very much the past where he's going with that. But the fact is that he's making the running on this issue, and I think it's reflective of their quite effective strategy. They've got ministers, they are making change, but at the same time, it's almost like he's acting like an opposition MP. And there's a few other issues where they've been really outspoken, differentiating from the government, even though they're literally in the heart of it.
Very quick word on Stuart Nash and his comments about what a woman was. Is this bad for his brand, do you think, Ben? Or actually, could it be something that maybe endears him to parts of the electorate?
I think he probably got a bit carried away with his new very best mates at New Zealand First, aimed for a bit of, back of the school bus locker room banter, and kind of overshot the mark. I think he was trying to be sort of gender critical, as Winston Peters was in his speech, and overshot the mark into old-fashioned misogyny. And so judgment remains an issue with Stuart Nash, but overall, look, as the sort of plain-talking former Labour guy, I think, New Zealand First will still see him as an asset, with a bit of a caution about language.
Gareth.
Well, coming out of the US was a new term for political time, which is the Scaramucci. He approximately lasted a fifth to a third of a Scaramucci. And Ben's right, he was appealing what he thought would play popular in that party, the sort of old boys will be boys club.
Indeed. Thank you very much, both of you. Gareth Hughes and Ben Thomas. Oh, my goodness. Gareth Hughes and Ben Thomas there on our political panel this morning.